I encountered Timothy Leary at the Los Angeles Book Fair in 1976. In the 60s, he was the main proponent of LSD as a spiritual awakening force, and his biography, which I brought to be signed for me to this LA Book Fair, was called High Priest. So he was at least the proponent of LSD in the 60s and in the counterculture that the mass media focused on the most, and he became almost synonymous with spreading the idea that LSD was an awakening agent and something of great spiritual value. And he was called by Richard Nixon the most dangerous man in America. He was eventually put on trial. He also was deeply involved in the drug dealing underworld as well. So Timothy Leary was, a crucial person in the counterculture of the American 60s and worldwide. So he had been let out of prison in 1976, just then, and I met him at the LA Book Fair and spoke to him primarily because I had read that he had recently been released from Folsom Prison and had served time right next to Charles Manson. And I asked him about that. And at that time, I really only knew about the case, what was available in the media. He gave me a certain look and a smile that suggested something much deeper than I could convey over the radio. But he said, in a way that really struck me, there is so much more to this case than anyone can ever imagine. And he spoke about how the Charles Manson that he heard, he never met him, but he heard him next door. They spoke to each other. They were placed in a cell with each other, next to each other in Folsom Prison. And it opened a door to my looking into, well, what does he mean? There's much more to this case than has ever been known. Because at the time, most people assumed that Bugliosi's Helter Skelter book had pretty much explained exactly what the case was about. And the TV movie that was made that year, 1976, for those who couldn't read, put it into the minds of the mass public as well. So that really intrigued me. The interesting thing about Leary is he had snitched on many of his drug dealer associates, and that's how he got out of prison. He had turned state's evidence against many of his former associates, which pretty much means you're a marked man in the underworld. And I suspect he was placed near Manson to try to get some kind of information from him as well. And in the early 80s, I got to know Leary slightly, but that's a whole other story. But it sort of confirmed my beliefs that he was, an extremely unethical person who was up to much more than we could imagine as well. But, I think it's interesting that he's who opened the door to my looking into this. So then, if you have any questions about that, we can cover it. But
Sure, I do have one actually. There have been many comments made by some authors that Leary was actively involved with either the CIA or the FBI, and in more ways than just drug experimentation. And I want to ask you if you believe that was the case.
Well, yes, I absolutely believe it, and I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to prove it. From my encounter with him, I really do believe he had some kind of intelligence agency background. A few simple things we can get into without digressing away from the Manson case, which is the central focus, but in a more overarching way, the real story we're talking about is what was the counterculture really, and how did the mass media report it, and how did its changing of the mass media coalesce with the way the intelligence agencies shifted public opinion at the time. So that's the larger story here, so I think it's significant. I personally believe there's plenty of reason to believe that Leary was working on the margins of the CIA. I don't think he was employed by them, but I think he was a sympathetic agent to them for many things I encountered and many things I've encountered in my research. For one thing, his employer at Harvard, which, that's no secret, Harvard and Yale have always been the main recruiting center in those days of the intelligence community, as they euphemistically call themselves. His employer at Harvard was definitely a CIA agent, and I'm pretty certain that the early LSD experiments Leary was doing with psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD at Harvard were sponsored, and that he shared the research with the CIA, which I'm not trying to make that sound sinister, because at that time, most of American academia was working closely with the intelligence agencies. The science departments of United States universities were working very closely with the Pentagon and with the CIA, because it was the Cold War, and there was a lot of research going on in academia that was useful to intelligence and military application. So I'm certain that Leary was on the margins of it, and I think he was deeply involved with some sort of CIA activity. That's my personal belief from knowing him. I think he was a completely unethical person who would have gone whichever way he was being paid. I'm talking about the normal activities of intelligence and law enforcement and the way that they interconnect with the criminal underworld. That's really what happened in the Manson case, and that's what Leary was involved in. And I think it all has a lot to do with the outlawing of LSD in 1966, which, as I've said before, and I make it clear in my book, The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, the Manson crimes and several lesser-known crimes that occurred in the counterculture hippie milieu in the 60s should best be compared to the crime wave that occurred during Prohibition. And I don't think people really get this connection, so I want to try to explain that, is that when the United States government made the lunatic decision during Prohibition to ban alcohol, of course it did not lead to an upsurge in morality. What it did was give organized crime a huge industry, which was bootlegging and the distribution of illegal alcohol. And that led to, all kinds of mayhem, as we know. That's what created the crime wave of the 1930s. The same thing happened in the 60s, when the federal government banned research and use of psychedelics and turned usage of them into a major felony. The mafia and various other organized crime factions moved in to sweep up the profits.